take it away with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I will try to kind of combine work that we've done with REMI in the area of resilience and also with kind of current epidemics. I don't think we can talk about anything without thinking about COVID these days. So I am trying my best. We'll see how it goes. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I am part of a research arm of Army Corps of Engineers. We have over 2,000 people, large budget. My team is in Boston, and we start collaborating with REMI, I believe, some 15 or 16 years ago. One of my area of research is linking decision analytics with data, and that's exactly how we started. Can you really make sense of REMI prediction in applied decision-making process? Next slide. And as already mentioned, I am now on detail to FEMA and Health and Human Services Region 1, which covers 6 states, and we basically provide all data analytics. So we model vaccines, supply chain, that's actually what we're just starting. We predict COVID cases, we allocate resources. Every week we brief regional administrators for both FEMA and HHS, as well as military commanders. Next slide. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about science of resilience and provide historical perspective on resilience. I will try to briefly talk about quantification of resilience. And we have not, instead of talking about resilience for epidemics as a case study, I would rather talk about financial implication of lack of resilience that we've done with REMI, but obviously the same methodology can be used in any resilience quantification cases, including epidemics. I will conclude with, of course, of this call to have REMI used everywhere, and I'm really believing that. It's a great tool. Next slide. We deal with complex system, and COVID clearly showed that system may collapse, and the question is how we think about that. So I also do a lot of work with OECD, and we had multiple conferences with economists, including Nobel Prize winners and all that. And I think the core of the problem, the way we see it with UNIT and OECD that focused on innovation, is that everything that we have is optimized from point of view of efficiency. That's kind of core optimization strategy. We need to be efficient, right? But at some level of efficiency, you start to lose resilience. If you are lean and efficient, you may not be able to have extra slack that allows you to recover. What we argue, and I hope I will show that it's important, that you need to balance efficiency as objective of systems in complex system development with resilience, which is ability to recover from often unexpected disruptions. So this curve that you see, it's kind of visualization of resilience. You have system functionality at a level that is acceptable, then you have disruption and system functionality goes down, and then it recovers this time. Well, the question is, if you have system built based on efficiency, what is the cost of not having resilience? So that's basic questions that I am asking. Next slide. But let's talk about historical perspective. in the news, you'll see all over that we have unprecedented pandemics, and we have not seen anything like that before. And of course, it's not true. 700 years ago, we have a pandemic of plague, and well, interestingly enough, it also originated in China, and in the time frame of a couple of decades, next slide, it reached Europe and specifically Venice. And what happened, as it's shown in this slide, after another 2 decades or so, 2/3 of population of Europe died. So this is what you can get out of pandemic. And of course, what we see now, at least as of now, is by far not unprecedented. Next slide. I was lucky enough to be able to teach in Venice for years in a row, and this is where I learned about plague, and that was like 2013. And I was thinking, well, if I am in Venice and we have this pandemic, what would I do with my current knowledge as risk assessor? Because in risk assessment, we kind of look at threat, vulnerability, consequences, and then we develop management alternatives, right? So if I had knowledge of today about methodology and applied in Venice with current state of knowledge and fact that they had, I would not be able to do risk assessment because they believe that threat is coming from God, and they built many churches. State of medicine was such that they saw skin issues and they try to apply metals, but of course that was not how plague needs to be treated. And then what was interesting is that they believe that disease is propagated by vampires. So how do you manage vampires? They put bricks in mouths of the people with the idea that if you are vampire, you cannot chew your way out of grave if you have brick in your mouth, right? So makes perfect sense. Anyway, so this is to make long story short. We may be, with our knowledge of COVID, we may be not too far from vampire hypothesis about the disease. We know very little, but we need to make a right decision. Next slide. And this is where science of resilience can be handy. A risk assessment, and this is kind of, again, when we design this efficient supply chain, efficient system that operates in our society, we try to harden them so they don't fail. But we can only do that when we know threats. If threats are unknown, like many emerging technologies, we have no idea what synbio will bring us on, advanced nanotechnology. But also in a situation like pandemics, we always knew that pandemics will come. It was not a big surprise, but what are you going to do? Are you going to invest, billions of dollars to prepare? And even if you do that, would we be prepared for COVID? Of course not. So we need to accept a loss of functionality as something that is going to happen. But then how you deal with that, right? So that's, again, a question that needs to be answered. Next slide. So the way we approach it, we need to quantify resilience in the system, and we need to be able to optimize for resilience, similarly like we're optimizing for cost, for efficiency, for whatever function we like to achieve. So how do you measure resilience? So there are metrics-based approaches. When we have metrics of resilience, we can combine them in indices or use decision analytics. That's what we do actually. But I will be focusing today on model-based ways to quantify resilience. But let me say a few words about metrics-based approaches. Next slide. So the way we approach it here, you can see several system domains: physical, information, or cyber, cognitive, social, and this resilience cycle that include prepare, absorb, recover, and adapt. And in each of these cells, you can have metrics associated with system performance, right? We like to know how, how you prepare it for energy blackout in physical domain, right? Do you have a generator? Do you have a flashlight? Do you have, this is kind of prepare, absorb. How would you recover? Do you have a contractor whom you can call to fix your electric system if they fail? Right? Can you adapt? Do you have like flashlights or extra generator? And you can really go through this exercise of thinking about different domain of your system and combine these metrics in a utility scale. And next slide shows how we use this type of approaches. Next slide. We basically create this weighted sum. We calculate baseline resilience as weighted sum of all these metrics across this matrix. And then we assess alternatives that can change these metrics. And by doing that, we change resilience. And then we can, look at individual alternatives. And in this case, alternative one is very costly, but it brings resilience well above threshold. But maybe alternative two is good enough. It's just a little bit above the threshold, but it costs less. So that's the type of consideration that we argue can be used in resilience evaluation. But next slide, it's far more interesting to really build resilience through network science. And in the network science, resilience is considered as a property of the network. And we look at the recovery of nodes and links of the system, their connectivity. And what we do, we try to connect this network models of resilience with economic models. And next slide shows case studies that we've done with REMI. We look at transportation network. What efficiency mean in transportation network? Well, it's ability for you to get to where you need at different times of the day. And if you cannot get there in time, you have a lot of traffic. We are talking about inefficient transportation network. But what is resilience here? Resilience is actually when you have something unexpected. You may have a snowstorm or bad accident. And the question that we ask in resilience calculation is how much of extra delay you're going to have if something unexpected happens. And the cost of that is very different. I know that if I leave house at whatever 8:30 a.m., I will get to the office at 9:30 a.m. So it takes me an hour. I will not schedule any meetings or anything crucial before 9:30. I know that if I leave my house at 10 a.m., it will take me only half an hour, right? So I can plan for that. But if it's winter and we have a little bit of snow, all of a sudden, no matter when I leave, I may get stuck in traffic, and this is lack of resilience. So next slide shows what we've done. We developed resilience model for network. We connected with REMI model TransSite that calculate economic impact associated with changes in time that takes to get from here to there. And then what we've done, we created this network disruptions. And because we like to look at resilience, we created random network disruptions at different levels. And what we try to calculate is how fast system recovers from disruptions. Next slide. So the resilience model is published, but we look at 40 cities. We basically just look at road networks, but of course it can be developed as more complicated. The model is quite simple. It's a simple gravity model. And what we measure is time required to go through the network and extra time that happens because of delays, traffic delays, as a result of inefficiency and as a follow-up of accidents. And we calibrate the model using observed data on efficiency, and then we calculate resilience. Next slide. So first thing we do, we generate disruption. And disruption may be from basically no disruption, 0 to 100%, like every road is disrupted. But, you know, we usually use 5% disruption, kind of makes sense. And it shows in this little insert that 5% disruption result in extra, whatever, 6 hours of delays annually per average driver with some distribution. While in Boston, it's much higher, it's 14 hours. So what it shows to you that Boston is less resilient than Los Angeles. Next slide. These disruptions, and this is like first result with REMI model, and I will ask Billy or whoever on REMI side to show the model in a minute, but it shows that these disruptions usually don't propagate more than like one season. So you have, if you have bad winter in 2019 and you have multiple cities, you can see that they disturb in a different ways, but they usually recover next year. But percentage of change in GDP is different for different cities for the same level of disruption. You have the most decline in San Francisco, least resilient city, and least in Los Angeles, right? So next slide. It shows all 40 cities, and you can see San Francisco and LA, as we already saw. San Francisco is least resilient and least efficient, while LA is also very inefficient, but one of the most resilient cities out of 40 we consider. Why? Because of network topology. In LA, you have many small roads, and if something happens, people can find a way around it. In San Francisco, you have equally bad traffic, a lot of people driving, but if something happens, instead of just losing a couple of hours to find back road, you may have catastrophic delays because you may get stuck on a bridge or in a stretch of the highway and you cannot exit. So topology of the network in San Francisco is very different. Next slide. So what are the costs associated with that? And I will ask Remy to talk, but this slide shows that we look not only random disruption, but we look at cyber disruption on intelligent transportation network. Next slide. And I think this is where I like Remy to say how they do calculation on their end. Billy?
Great, thank you, Igor. So I have Mr. Jeff Dykes, and was also worked very closely with Dr. Igor Linkov and myself on the analysis. So Jeff, can you bring up the presentation, please?
Yeah, sure. Let me just share my screen.
I'll share my screen also too. So we're going to go over this pretty quickly. We want to try to make sure we can end close to have time for the Q&A session too. So Jeff, let's want to kind of bring up the our portion. What we took in as we were working with Dr. Linkov, and as we worked with multiple DOTs across the nation, traditionally how we looked at unforeseen event, a disruption, we looked at through travel demand model, incorporating the VMTs and VHGs into the model and looking at that delay time as a disruption. But as Dr. Linkov was explaining, there is a difference between a delay and a disruption. And what we tried to incorporate in looking into the REMI model, we tried to incorporate these nuances into the REMI model, looking beyond just what Dr. Mark Elin mentioned also in the previous presenter, that on the cost aspect of things. What we also wanted to look at is how does these disruptions, what additional from Igor's disruption matrix model, can we take into the consideration of its impact on specifically labor access and also commodity access. So not just the travel time that was sort of disrupted, but how does that actually go on, and can we actually model that, taking his information and integrate with REMI to how does it impact the both labor and commodity access, and therefore impacting the rest of the regional economy. So next slide, please. So we took their traffic disruption model, worked closely with them, and we evaluated the results of the disruption severity of 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, and 5%. Well, you're saying these are kind of like random numbers, but what 1% is basically we're talking about almost like a week of delay out of and 5% is around 3 weeks delay into the model. So we incorporate that information into the model.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go back. Next slide, please.
Next slide. Yeah, so we
go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh yeah.
Jeff.
Okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say what we noticed from these disruptions is the economic impact was not exactly proportional to what we entered. So we entered the 1%, and then we looked at the economic impact of that, cost of production and change in commodity access. And then as we increase up to 3, 4, 5%, it starts to level off a little. So we notice some of a curve there. So yeah, it was an interesting trend that we noticed.
Next slide. Okay, and let's go on to the next one too. After that. And also, from here, I'm going to show like how we actually entered the model, like what Dr. Elin mentioned, that the lever that he did with a lot of his resilience projects looked at the production cost and the direct, indirect, and induced effects of things through the production cost variable. Next slide. As we can see from next slide, please, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
From here, how transportation cost goes in and affects production costs, affecting market share, affecting the overall economy. Next slide. Yep. Next. Made it pretty fancy, Jeff. Okay. As it kind of get production costs there and affecting the overall economy. Again, so that primary lever that we looked at is through the delivered price variable, showing how the delivered price affects the overall cost of production, market share, and then the overall economy. But then the levers that we decide to pull, working closely with Dr. Linkov. Next slide. Is the commodity access to commodities, because that's what we're trying to do. The disruption in the network itself, how does it affect the different industries, access to commodities for the production process, and also, next slide, and also the labor. Next slide, please. Because like what Dr. Linkov mentioned, it's not just a delay, it's actually a disruption in access to those intermediate inputs. Over here, just to kind of show the point, is if we do a 1% delay, just testing out the model, across the different metro regions as the US, you can see that the national GDP impact is around 0.12% to negative 0.22%. So it's within the 1% input leads to a very similar output in the GDP across, regardless of the metro regions. Let's go to the next slide, please. And what was interesting is when we did a disruption and using Dr. Linkov's disruption model, is that the GDP changes quite a bit. It ranges from negative 0.17% to negative 1.89%. And a lot of this is due to, as we were going through the model, is it depends on the industry that disrupts, the industry mix, access to labor, and also to commodities. So the range of the disruption affects the cities a lot more different than just looking at the transportation costs of things. This, when we take into commodity access and labor access, as you can see, the GDP across different regions varies much larger than if it was just a transportation impact, transportation delivered price impact. Okay, next slide, please. Over here, across, and just looking at that, and this also flows into the rest of the nation. This is national impacts. If we do a 1% disruption and in the system itself instead of a delay. Okay. And here, as we're showing, we're doing the 2% here, and then the GDP is actually starting to accelerate. Next slide. To 3%, and then where it starts to level off, 4%, and then 5%. So this was a very interesting collaboration with Igor's group on using the REMI model and looking at beyond just the transportation costs, but specifically looking at how a disruption in commodity access and a disruption in labor access might actually affect different regions differently. So instead of just kind of looking at a transportation cost side of things, I think it's especially very relevant of today's pandemic is what is the impact on access? What is the impact on labor access? What is the impact on commodity access? And how does that affect the competitiveness of each and every one of these regions? Okay, I think. And then the next slide. So fundamentally, if we're just looking at travel time delay, that's just part of the equation. But it's also important as we're looking at these. It'll be interesting to further look at how these different regions, specifically by different industries, how the delay and how the disruption in labor access and also in commodity access kind of for the same industry affects different different regions over time. Okay. And that's all Jeff and I have.
Okay, can we go back to my slides? And I will try to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Billy.
Looks like.
Yeah, so yeah, next slide. We've seen all this. Next. So interesting question is like how all this difference get reflected regionally, and what we look how big cities are impacted by small cities. Is cost of resilience in general is cost of lack of resilience is bigger in big cities. So it looks like indeed big cities are more vulnerable than small cities. And next slide. And cities with cities that produce a lot per capita, like Seattle and Houston, they are more have more losses than cities that are not producing that much. So again, in the context of what we observe now with COVID, what are the impacts in the rural area versus urban area? How you can predict all that? It all depends on the network and economic situation. So why is important? Next slide. It is important because optimization for efficiency and resilience is different. If you like to build more efficient infrastructure, you can just add lanes to the highway, but it will make you efficient but not resilient. Like in Florida, you have a couple of big highways. They are efficient, but Florida cities are comparatively less resilient just because there are no smaller roads If one of these highways is blocked, you're stuck. To deal with resilience, you need to make alternative ways of doing same things. You need to build new roads. And if you think about not just transportation network, but that's what I'm getting to now, vaccine production, you can be very efficient. You have one chicken factory that produces all flu vaccine for Sanofi, and this is a really true case. But if you get chicken flu in that factory, Sanofi and flu vaccine production will stop for a long time, because it's not just any Tyson chicken that they need. They need a very specialized chicken production facility and eggs to be able to do what they need to do, right? So how are you going to assess all that? How are you going to optimize and balance, one chicken factory versus two, which will cost Sanofi a lot more money, but from a resilience point of view, it's more important. So next slide. I really feel that the whole idea of resilience is very important in epidemic spread. And, funny enough, we did, on the tail of Ebola, we published this paper when we did modeling of resilience in disease spread. And next slide shows that if you look at travel restriction and getting a level of fear in population up or down, you have very narrow region when you need to start considering resilience and shift in the different way of optimization. Simply speaking, any restriction will decrease risk of disease propagation, but they will increase economic consequences. That's what we show here. So the balance of restricting economics, it's really fragile. You really need to have models that will help you to decide. So now we're going through this experiment when we shut down the economy without clear guidance, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to figure out whether we did the right thing or not. It's not black and white as we see here. Next slide. Well, I guess I spent enough time, but this is very briefly what we do for FEMA and COVID. We try to connect policy with model for disease propagation and economic policies that the administration likes to have. Next slide. We connect all these models together, and I hope in one day we'll be able to connect REMI models, and we're already talking about that. Next slide. But yeah, this is our models for disease propagation. They're really good, actually. We're part of CDC Ensemble Forecasts, and yeah, no time to talk about that. Next slide. And we use it for distribution of hospital beds, PPE, ventilators, fatality management. So that's kind of in our scope of work. Next slide. And yeah, I work with OECD. So with OECD, we try to figure out what would be economic consequences and how economic thinking should be changed to adjust for pandemics. Next slide. So what happened in Venice, right? How 700 years ago, what did they do that helped them? And well, what they did, they basically developed public health system the way we know today. They were first to introduce protective clothes on the right that separate physician and patient. They sent people to Lazaretto Islands, sick people, and they introduced quarantine. Like all ships that come to Venice were quarantined in that little island on the bottom. And initially they used 20 days. It didn't work, and they started use 40 days, which worked for plague. Next slide. So what does it mean? What they did? Well, it means that they act on the disease propagation network, and this is what we do now. We published this paper back in 2014, way ahead of the time, but we argue in that paper that protective clothes disrupt disease propagation at level of local level. Lazaretto Island disrupted level of the community, while quarantine is acting on regional level. And all of those disruptions result in slowing down disease propagation, and that's kind of public health the way we know it now. Next slide. These resilience ideas are really important, and they can help us not to collapse as Europe did in Black Death when 2/3 of the population died. Resilience would allow us to move to the next and a better state of the system by designing it, and that's why we need to quantify resilience, and that's why we need to connect with economic outputs to figure out how you optimize for that. Next slide. And the reason for that is that we cannot harden the system. On one end, we cannot prevent system from failing, no matter how much we invest. And we cannot avoid pandemics. They will happen. So a cost of reducing risk should be trading off with cost of recovery and investing in recovery. And that's all I like to say. I think REMI types of modeling linked with resilience modeling is really powerful. And next slide shows all papers we published, and next slide shows a couple of books. We'll be glad to share and collaborate. That's it. Thank you.